The grand hall of Eloria shimmered with a golden glow as thousands of floating orbs hovered above the polished marble floor, casting gentle light across the ancient carvings and towering crystal pillars which had witnessed the rise and fall of countless rulers over the centuries, and now stood silent as history prepared to take a sharp turn. Once more, Princess Lyra stood at the center of the hall, tall and proud, her silver hair falling like liquid metal down her back, her violet eyes locked on the towering figure seated at the throne, her father Emperor Kale, ruler of the Ardent Dominion, a man whose voice had once shaken warlords and whose decisions had sculpted empires, but this time his command had struck a place deeper than politics, deeper than loyalty, and far deeper than the rules of royal duty. The courtiers stood in complete silence, their eyes flickering between the emperor and the princess, for they all knew what was about to be declared. They had whispered about it in corridors, speculated during council sessions, and waited breathless for the confirmation. And when the emperor finally rose from his throne and stretched out his hand toward his daughter, the words fell from his lips like a quiet storm. Lyra, you are to marry the human ambassador, the one called Rain. This will seal the unity between Earth and the Dominion and ensure peace for centuries to come. For a moment no one moved and no one breathed. The words hung heavy in the air like smoke, and every face turned to Lyra, expecting submission, duty, obedience. But Lyra stepped forward, lifted her chin, and spoke with a voice sharp enough to cut through stone. I refuse to marry a human. The shock was like thunder rolling across the room. Gasps escaped from every corner, and the emperor's eyes narrowed, though his expression remained calm behind the mask of command. Do you know what you are saying, child? Do you understand what you risk by speaking against this decision? I do, she said, and I will not change my answer. This is not unity, it is surrender hidden in robes of tradition. You cannot command love, and you cannot build peace through chains. Emperor descended from the throne, slowly, his heavy cloak trailing behind him, his presence filling the hall like a wave. Lyra stood her ground as he approached. The only sound was the quiet hum of the ancient energy walls that guarded the palace from the void of space. You speak like a child, you speak like someone who does not yet understand the weight of worlds, Kale said, and his voice echoed with centuries of burden. We gave Earth its place in this galaxy. We gave them a seat at our table, and they proved their strength. Yes, but they are still learning. They are still dangerous. This union will balance them. It will bind them. You mean it will tame them? Lyra replied, her words steady and without hesitation. You fear them, father, but I do not. We should be learning from them, not using marriage like a leash. The emperor turned his back on her and walked toward the viewing window that showed the stars outside glowing like scattered embers among the dark. His voice lowered, but it carried across the hall. You have one cycle to reconsider, Lyra. If you do not agree to this alliance, you forfeit your right to the throne and your voice in the council. So be it, she answered without pause. Her heart thundered in her chest, but her face held no trace of fear. The next morning, across the Ardent Dominion, the news spread faster than any official decree. The princess had defied the emperor. She had rejected the marriage to the human ambassador, the one chosen by the Earth Council, the one raised from the ruins of the Terran Wars, who had negotiated peace through courage and diplomacy. Some praised her courage, others called it foolish, some whispered of rebellion and disloyalty. But most were simply stunned, for no royal had ever denied the will of the throne and walked away without punishment. Far from the palace, high above the planet on an orbital platform, the human ambassador Rain stood watching the news stream play out across a floating screen. His brow furrowed, his expression unreadable. So she said no, he muttered to himself, and after a pause he added, good. He had never wanted this alliance either, though he understood its weight. He had never agreed with how it was being forced, arranged from above like pieces on a board. But now this princess, this alien noble, had done something he never expected. She had said what he had been thinking since the moment the offer was placed before him back in the palace. Lyra walked the gardens alone, her thoughts loud within her mind, questions swirling like storms. Had she done the right thing? Had she placed herself above the needs of the Dominion? Had she stepped onto a path from which there was no return? But the stars overhead offered no answers, only silence and space and cold. Fire. She touched a blue-leafed flower gently and wondered what kind of person this Rain was. From afar during a council session, his stance firm, his gaze sharp but unreadable. The humans were still a mystery to her, all fire and invention, and unpredictable bursts of strength and emotion. She did not hate them. She did not even dislike them. But she refused to be bound to one as a sacrifice for peace. Peace should not come with a chain around the wrist. It should be chosen freely, and she had chosen to be free. Elsewhere, deep in the imperial chambers, Hale stood before a gathering of advisors. None dared speak first, not after what had happened. She has her mother's spirit, one of them finally whispered. And that is exactly what I fear, the Emperor replied without turning his gaze from the stars. The clock had begun to tick, and the fate of two worlds now stood on a fragile line, held not by treaties or armies, but by two young hearts that refused to be ruled. The Chamber of Accords echoed with quiet voices as foreign dignitaries floated across polished floors, their long robes trailing behind like flowing waves, and above them ancient symbols of the Dominion hovered in soft light, casting golden glows upon the delegates who had come to witness the meeting between two uneasy allies. Princess Lyra entered with her head high-dressed in silver threads that shimmered like moonlight. Woven with the emblems of her house, every movement she made was watched by 1,000 eyes. Yet her own gaze was fixed forward, sharp and unreadable, her steps steady and slow, as if she walked upon the edge of a blade. Across the hall stood Rain, the human ambassador, not in a robe, not in armor, but in a simple suit, dark and clean, designed more for function than flair. He stood without bowing, without fidgeting, his hands behind his back, his eyes watching Lyra, not with admiration nor disdain, but with something quieter, something calculating yet calm. Their first meeting was not arranged by them, it was planned by the Emperor's advisors, placed neatly into the ceremonial schedule, as if it were just another formality, and not the beginning of a storm. When they stood face to face, silence held the room. No words came at first, only a quiet study of each other, as if both were trying to see beyond the titles, beyond the duty, beyond the expectations of billions. So you are the one they chose, Lyra said. Finally, her voice neither harsh nor soft, but measured like a blade resting on a table. And you are the one who said no, Rain replied, not smiling, not frowning, simply stating what the Thio stars already knew. She raised a brow, not expecting honesty, not expecting him to be so still, so unaffected by everything around him. Do you think it was foolish? She asked, stepping closer, just enough to close the formal distance, but not enough to seem personal. I think it was honest, Rain answered, and there was a hint of something deeper, something unspoken. I never wanted it either, but I understand why they pushed for it. They stood in silence again, while the courtiers and guests remained quiet, watching from a safe distance, waiting for sparks, waiting for tension, waiting for anything that could be used in whispers and reports. Later, Lyra tilted her head slightly. You are not like the others, she said slowly, and Rain gave the smallest shrug. Perhaps I am just too tired to pretend. The moment passed, the rituals began, and both played their parts, walking the ceremonial path together, standing for shared declarations, repeating phrases written long before either of them were born. And yet, underneath it all, the air was thick with something different, something deeper than protocol. That evening, during the official welcome banquet, Lyra sat at a long table, lined with food from 20 worlds, but her plate remained untouched. She watched the crowd, listened to the laughter, the praise, the false smiles, the veiled threats, and felt a storm rising within her. Rain sat far at the end among human scientists and Earth officials, but his eyes drifted toward her now and then, watching as she remained distant, untouched by the celebration, meant to honor their so-called unity. Midway through the night, an alarm sounded, soft at first, then sharper. Guards moved quickly, forming shields around the honored guests and pulling weapons that shimmered With plasma heat, a drone had entered the hall, small and fast, weaving through defenses, a flicker of metal and light. It darted toward Rain, but before it reached him, Lyra was already moving faster than anyone expected, faster than any princess was supposed to move. She raised her hand, summoned the energy from within. A blast of white power burst from her palm, striking the drone midder. It exploded in a soft flash, the parts falling harmlessly to the floor. The hall was filled with chaos, but Lyra stood calm, her hand still raised, her breath steady. Rain looked at her, not with fear, not with shock, but with something different. A flicker of understanding, a quiet nod of thanks that passed between them, unnoticed by others. Later, when the hall was cleared and security doubled, they found themselves alone for a brief moment in the corridor behind the chambers. "Why did you do that?" Rain asked, not out of pride but of genuine confusion. "I thought you wanted nothing to do with this." "I do not," she said simply, "but I do not wish you dead either. That would only give the council more reason to tighten the chains on us both." He leaned against the wall, eyes watching her, as if seeing a part of her the public never knew. "So it is duty after all." "No," she said softly, "it is survival, and maybe something more, maybe. I am tired of being used as a piece on a board. I thought you were just another pawn. But maybe you are not." Rain gave a faint smile, nothing large, just a twitch of the lips, a gesture of someone not used to smiling but trying anyway. "Are both caught in a game we did not start," he said, "and the pieces are moving faster than we can follow." Lyra nodded, her eyes distant for a moment, and then she turned and walked away, leaving him in the quiet corridor alone with his thoughts. Outside, the stars still burned cold and bright, as if nothing had changed, but deep within the heart of the Dominion something had shifted ever so slightly. A princess who once rejected her fate, and a human who never wanted power, were beginning to see through the smoke around them, and in that shared clarity, the real story was just beginning. The stars outside moved in silence, but within the halls of the Dominion Palace, whispers grew like shadows, gathering in corners and drifting through marble corridors where no light could truly reach. Lyra moved through the quiet chambers with steps light and sure, her eyes sharp, but her mind heavier than ever before since the attack during the banquet. She had not known peace, not because she feared for herself, but because something about it felt too clean, too perfect, too well-timed to be an accident from a group of extremists. She had read the security reports herself. She had studied the fragments of the drone, its make, its coding, its origins, and though the investigators claimed it was from a fringe Earth group, she knew better. The signature was too precise, too familiar, like something drawn from the vaults of Dominion design. "There are lies in the air," she whispered to herself as she walked past the Chamber of Mirrors, a place where history was carved into glowing glass and every face of the past stared down in judgment. In another wing of the palace, Rain sat inside a secured human diplomatic chamber, the room filled with quiet screens and humming tech. His people had already finished their investigation and reached the same strange conclusion: the attack had not come from Earth, not from any known rebel or splinter faction, and that meant only one thing: someone from the inside wanted the alliance to fail. Rain had seen enough diplomacy to recognize sabotage when he saw it, and this time it was not from the usual loud voices. It was from hands that moved carefully, silently, behind curtains of tradition and legacy. Sent a message, brief and direct, to Lyra: "Meet me alone, West Gardens. No eyes, no guards. We need to speak." Lyra received the message just as the sun dipped behind the twin towers of the city, casting a long shadow across the sky. She left without alerting anyone, walking through hidden paths beneath the palace, a network she had explored as a child when rules had not yet chained her curiosity. In the West Gardens, among silver trees that glowed under the fading light, they met without words at first, just standing within the quiet, as if waiting for the walls to breathe before they dared speak. Rain looked at her and without preamble said, "The attack was staged, and we both know it. The question is why." Lyra nodded slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of a glowing leaf as she spoke. "I believe someone in the High Council does not want this union, not because of fear of humans, But because they fear losing control, Rain folded his arms, his gaze not accusing, but thoughtful. Power hates change, even when it comes wrapped in peace. Lyra sat on a low stone bench, her expression unreadable. My father is not blind, but he is proud. Too proud to see that his own house may be rotting from inside. Then we prove it. Rain said, his voice steady, not with emotion, but with certainty. If we are both being used, then we work together not as partners in marriage, but as allies in truth. Lyra looked at him for a long moment, then she gave a single nod, not of agreement, but of decision. Over the next days the two met in secret, across quiet chambers within hidden libraries and deep archives under the city. They moved like shadows, tracing lines in the dust left by those who had thought themselves unseen. They discovered coded messages, erased logs, misdirected orders, and money flowing in circles that led always to the same name. A counselor named Marine, one of the Emperor's oldest allies, a man trusted by all, whose smile masked the sharpness of a dagger, and whose hand had touched every corner of Dominion politics for over 4 decades. The evidence was thin, not enough to convict, but enough to burn if held to the right light. They had one chance, and it had to be perfect. During their investigation, something began to shift between Lyra and Rain. Not spoken, not acted upon, but quietly formed in the spaces between words and the silences that felt less like distance and more like trust. They argued at times, they disagreed on method and motive. Rain saw logic where Lyra saw feeling. She leaned on instinct, while he built steps from facts. But they listened, and they adapted, and they began to see the enemy, not only in Maren, but in the system that allowed him to grow. One night, after a long trail of encrypted transmissions, they stood in the palace vault facing a sealed door, behind which lay the last piece, the final recording that could expose the plot. The door was guarded by a cipher only royal blood could open, and Lyra reached forward, placing her hand upon the scanner, her voice low. I never thought I would break my oath for a human. Rain replied without a smile, but with calm strength, you are not doing it for me, you are doing it for what is right, and that is all that matters. The door opened slowly, revealing the ancient memory core within, glowing with untouched data. They downloaded what they needed, then sealed it again behind them, walking together through the dark hall like two conspirators to the not by force, but by choice. That night, as they returned to their separate chambers, neither spoke of what was growing between them, because they both knew the danger was not yet past, and the end was still beyond the horizon. But for the first time since the command was given, since the storm had begun, Lyra did not feel alone, and Rain no longer felt like a stranger in a galaxy of powerful beings. They had found truth, and more importantly, they had found trust, and in a galaxy where both were rare, that was something worth holding on to. The central spire of the Dominion Palace rose into the sky like a blade cutting through the clouds, its glass walls reflecting stars and storm alike, while inside those same walls games of power moved unseen behind smiles and silence. Lyra walked alone through the diplomatic corridor, dressed in the ceremonial robes of her house, with a veil covering her hair and energy bands pulsing faintly around her wrists. The council had summoned her not for punishment, but for appearance. They wanted her to be seen standing beside Rain once more during the upcoming peace declaration, as if nothing had happened, as if she had never refused the marriage, as if the recent events had never scarred the surface of their perfect union. The truth she now held in her hands burned like a quiet fire. The data crystal hidden inside her robe contained the recordings, the false signatures, the misdirected attacks, and the secret conversations that tied Counselor Maren to the sabotage. It also held proof that the Emperor had been warned long ago, but chose to look the other way, blinded by loyalty and the weight of old friendships. Rain waited at the lower wing, where human diplomats moved with subtle alertness, their body language sharp. Though their faces calm, he had kept himself out of the news ever since the banquet, appearing only in formal sessions and speaking only when required. He had become a mirror to Lyra, distant but present, cold but aware. When she arrived, he did not ask questions, he only nodded once, a simple gesture that meant he understood what they were about to do. They moved together toward the great hall where the peace ceremony was to begin. The chamber filled with officials, nobles, delegates, and ambassadors from dozens of worlds, seated in quiet rows while cameras hovered silently above, recording every expression and every word that would follow. At the front stood the emperor, robed in imperial gold, with his voice prepared to deliver the scripted words of unity. Beside him stood Mayra, calm, composed as always, his eyes scanning the room, like a man watching pieces fall exactly where he placed them. Lyra stepped forward with rain behind her, and for a moment, the hall seemed to freeze. The music softened, the lights dimmed, the world paused. I asked for voice, she said, her voice rising clear across the chamber. I asked for witness under the ancient laws of the dominion I bring. Claim of betrayal. Murmurs broke like ripples across the crowd. The emperor raised a hand, but Lyra continued without pause, her voice steady and loud. I present evidence that the attack during the Earth Dominion banquet was orchestrated by a member of this very council. I present proof that this peace was never meant to succeed, and that both Earth and I were being used as targets to trigger fear and failure. She turned and handed the crystal to the prime recorder, who activated the data stream and filled the air with holographic projections, voices and images flowing around the room. Marin's voice echoed, first calm and calculated as he spoke to hidden contacts, giving orders to redirect security, to plant false signatures to ensure that blame would fall on humans and that unity would collapse. The room exploded with sound, shouts, gasps, and movement. But Lyra stood still, her eyes never leaving her father, who had not spoken yet not moved. Marin stepped forward, his voice calm, even as his world fell apart. These recordings are false. This is an attempt to distract from the princess's refusal and her disregard for tradition. Lyra answered quickly, this is not rebellion, this is truth, and it will not be buried under ceremony. The emperor's voice finally rose, quiet but firm silence. The chamber obeyed and the crowd settled once more. Kale looked not at Marin, not at the data, not at the angry whispers, but at his daughter, his eyes filled with 1,000 thoughts that never reached his lips. Leave us, all of you now. His voice echoed with finality, and slowly the chamber emptied until only the emperor, Lyra, Rain, and Marin remained within its massive walls. For long minutes no one spoke. Then Kale moved slowly toward Marin, his steps heavy with memory and pain. You were my oldest advisor, my friend, my shield during the fires of the border wars, the voice of reason in my youth, and yet you betrayed not only me but the very roots of this dominion. Marin stood tall, even as his mask fell. I did what I had to do. We are letting humans rise too fast. They are chaos, they are emotion, they are fire that will burn us all. We needed control, and you gave it away. When you opened the doors, Kale raised a hand and spoke with sorrow, not anger. You are relieved of all duties from this moment. Your voice will never again shape the future of this dominion. Guards entered and took Marin without resistance, though his eyes remained cold and focused on Lyra, as if she were the beginning of everything he feared. When silence returned, Kale turned to Lyra. You have done what no one else dared. You brought truth where I failed to see it. You acted with courage beyond title and duty. She waited for judgment, but instead he said, you are no longer bound by blood to follow this path. If you wish to walk away, I will not stop you. Lyra spoke softly. I never wanted power, I never wanted a throne, but I will not walk away from what I now believe must change. Kale nodded, then looked at Rain, who had spoken not a word through it all, but whose presence remained firm. You have earned respect beyond any treaty. Earth will be seen as more than just a rising power. They will be seen as equal outside. The stars still moved slowly, uncaring of the storms below, but within the hearts of those two who had once stood on opposite sides, a shift had taken place, not in politics, not in treaties, but in something far more powerful. They had begun to trust and to believe in something, built not from tradition, but from choice. That was a power neither empire nor council could control. Council chamber that once stood proud with marble light and towering symbols of unity, now felt different, stripped of its illusion and weight. The very air had shifted, voices were quieter, steps more careful, the sense of order still present, but no longer blinding those who walked within its walls. Lyra stood at the edge of the terrace, high above the capital city, as the morning sun painted the clouds in soft gold and silver below her. The towers stretched into the sky like fingers, reaching for peace, but the peace she now understood was not born from alliance papers or forced tradition. It came from truth and from the freedom to choose. Events of the past days had turned the heart of the Dominion upside down. Power structures that seemed unshakable had cracked under the weight of exposed lies, and the people both in the inner worlds and the border colonies had seen something new. A royal who stood not just against her enemies, but against the very system that crowned. Herain arrived beside her without words, his footsteps light but sure. The wind moved through his dark coat, and his face held the calm of someone who had walked through fire and returned not burnt, but changed. The council has confirmed the decision, Lyra said softly, not turning, yet her voice carried with clarity. The Emperor has stepped down, and a new body will take shape, built not on bloodline but on merit, and will reign. Not at once, his eyes looking not at the horizon, but at her. So they finally listened, not because they believed, but because they could no longer ignore what you showed them. She turned to face him, then her expression unreadable for a moment, then softened by something warmer. The marriage treaty has been cancelled. The alliance will stand, but without the ceremony, without the binding of names. Rain took a slow breath, not of relief but of reflection. I never wanted to be part of it, not like that, and yet something changed. I never thought I would find understanding on this side of the stars. Lyra stepped closer, her hands resting at her sides. I never thought I would see a human as more than a threat, more than a symbol. But then I saw you, not the ambassador, not the representative of Earth, but the man who stood when he could have run, who listened when others shouted, and who trusted me even when I gave him no reason to. They stood close now, the city behind them alive with movement, but the space between them held something greater than history. It held choice. You once said I will not marry a human. Rain said, his voice light, not mocking, just remembering. And I meant it, Lyra answered, because I thought marriage was a chain, a sacrifice, a tool for power and silence. But now I see it can be something else. It can be a step not taken in fear or pressure, but in trust and respect. So, what do you say now? Rain asked quietly, his voice steady, but his eyes waiting hers held his without blinking. She raised her hand, not in command, but in invitation. I choose this. I choose you, not because I have to, not because anyone told me to, not for peace, not for throne, but because when the world fell apart, you stood beside me, and I do not want to walk the new world without you. Rain reached out and took her hand, not with force, not with formality, but with the kind of stillness that speaks louder than speeches. Then he smiled, a real smile, a human smile filled with weight and light, and said, then let us walk together, not as tools of the past, but as builders of what comes next. The weeks that followed, the galaxy watched as Earth and the Dominion reformed their connection, not through marriage, not through command, but through shared effort, trade, learning, exchange, and mutual growth. Diplomats walked beside inventors, soldiers beside scientists, and cultures began to open, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. Lyra was offered the title of High Counselor, the first leader of the reformed Dominion, chosen not by legacy, but by vote. She accepted, not to rule, but to guide, and beside her, Rain stood not as a prince or consort, but as an equal advisor, an explorer, and a partner. In one quiet evening, far from the noise of politics and galaxies, they returned to the gardens where it had all begun, the silver trees still glowing, the same soft light, the air filled with memory. Lyra walked slowly along the path, her hand brushing leaves that once listened to her doubts. Rain followed quietly, then stopped beside her as she turned and smiled. You know they still speak of the day, I said. No, she whispered with a quiet laugh. Some call it the start of rebellion, others call it foolish pride. And what do you call it? Rain asked, leaning slightly toward Harry. Call it the first step toward freedom, she answered. And now I call it the moment I began to find something real. Rain nodded the stars reflecting. In his eyes, not all stories need to start with yes. Sometimes no is just the beginning. Together they stood beneath the endless sky, two souls from different worlds, no longer bound by command or fear, but joined by something stronger: choice, understanding, and the strange, unbreakable spark that only grows when truth is allowed to breathe. The story that began with defiance ended not in surrender, but in unity, not in silence, but in shared voice. And somewhere beyond the stars, a new chapter waited to be written by two hearts who had once been forced to walk a path, but now walked it by will. The end.